What's up, you guys? So in today's video, we're going to be talking about something very crucial, not only for your present, but also for your future, which is how much of a home can you really afford based off of your salary. Mortgages is one of the most significant wealth drainers in today's society and economy, and is typically your largest expense each month by far, no doubt about it. Nationwide, the average payment for a new home is $2,317 a month, and can get much higher in places like Hawaii, where it's $3,696 a month, or even in California, where it's $3,399 a month, and even places like Massachusetts, where it's $3,021 a month. So, we're going to go over exactly how much of a salary you need in order to buy a home in each price point based off of guidelines on best practices from lenders, the current market prices, and as of today's sky-high interest rates. So let's quickly talk about why a topic like this is so important. It's because if you have a house payment that eats up a significant amount of your income, you essentially don't have any money. You're over leveraged compared to what you really can afford. In some cases, you can get qualified for a loan up to 50% of your take-home pay, which leaves you with absolutely nothing left over, but people still do it. Then you can't even afford necessities or even think about planning for the future, like investing into a 401k or putting money aside for your kid's college fund. So before we even think about buying a home, we need to take care of a couple of crucial steps before the buying process starts. You want to at least make sure that you have an emergency fund set aside. Be debt-free, not saying that you have to be debt-free, but it can really set you up long-term, and implementing a budget that you adhere to. If you do those couple of things, you can really set yourself up for success, and we'll go over a little bit later on in the video why those things are so crucial. Because home prices are surging and interest rates are in the 6.5 to 7% range, it's an important question to ask yourself, what's the most efficient way to buy a home? And what are some of the guidelines that I can follow so that way I don't end up home poor and can't afford to do crucial things that create core memories like go on vacation or take trips with your family? So let's quickly go over a couple of expenses and things to consider before buying a home. So when you buy a home, you have a mortgage, which is broken down between a mix of principal and equity amortized over a term between 15 to 30 years. After which that period ends, the home is paid off in full. Then you have your interest rate, which can either be fixed or variable rate. If it's fixed, then the payment doesn't change over the course of the term of the loan. Variable rate or adjustable rate is just when the rate periodically adjusts based on an index, which just reflects the cost to the lender of borrowing on the credit markets. Those are typically not recommended, but the main benefit for them is when interest rates are really low, you could potentially be paying significantly less than if the loan was fixed rate. Then you have your property taxes, which is based off of the purchase price and has a range depending on what state you live in. This also adjusts annually as property and real estate prices continue to increase, so that's something to be mindful for. Then you have your insurance costs. So the lender just wants to make sure that you have adequate insurance to cover any damages to the home, resulting from things like theft or weather, so a tornado or hurricane, or even from a fire, which is something that I recently experienced as my parents' home caught on fire last year in 2022. Luckily, they had the insurance to cover the damages. Now you have your repairs. So when things break, as they often do, and it always seems to feel like it comes at the worst possible time. Things like your AC or a refrigerator. We recently just replaced our freezer because it went bad. Your cold water heater, or heaven forbid, a pipe bursts. And then finally, we want to be proactive and spend on things that increase the value of our home. So maybe you decide to remodel the bathroom or do landscaping, things that can really only benefit you when you go to sell your home and make a profit. Alright, so now let's talk about some of the recommended guidelines on how much you need or how much you should make in order to buy a home. So first is the 25% rule, which states that you shouldn't spend any more than 25% of your gross monthly take-home pay on your mortgage payment, which includes those expenses that we talked about earlier, like your insurance costs and property taxes. So if your gross monthly take-home pay is $8,000 after taxes, you would take that and then multiply it by 25%. And the number that you get there is the maximum amount that your payment should be. So this is a rule and guideline that's applicable to all salary ranges regardless of how much money you make. So that could be $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year, $200,000 a year, and even $500,000 a year. You should just know how much your gross monthly income is and multiply that by 25%. So to buy a home in the $400,000 range, like this one in Maryland, or like this one in Pennsylvania, or even like this one in California with 20% down and a current interest rate of 7.23%, your monthly payment would be $2,507. So if that number is greater than 25% of your monthly gross take-home pay, then you can't afford to do it. If you wait until interest rates go down again, your monthly payment will decrease significantly. Just to use as an example, if you looked at interest rates from November 2021 when they were 3.1%, that same home would only cost you $1,695 a month. But if we look at the historical data on interest rates, they haven't been this high since 2007. You can see in the 80s when it got as high as 16.9% when they were battling inflation. Alright, so another rule or guideline to go by is the 30-33 rule. And with that, there's obviously 3 main points to consider and follow, and that will tell you how much of a home you can really afford. So the first 30 states that you shouldn't spend or exceed 30% of your gross income on your total housing payments. So say you make gross $100,000 a year, you can afford to spend $2,083 a month. If you make $50,000 a year, then that number would be $1,041 a month. And if you make, say, $200,000 a year, that number would be $4,166 a month. The second part of the 30-33 rule states that you should have at least 30% of the home's value saved up in cash or liquid assets. So the recommendation is that you put 20% down and then save 10% in cash in case of any emergencies, or if any repairs need to be made in case of pipe bursts, or if the AC needs to be replaced. Why the 20% down is so beneficial is because it gives you better terms with the lenders and it gives you more equity in the home. It also helps you avoid something called PMI, which is private mortgage insurance, which essentially is just a fee that the lender tacks onto your mortgage as a little extra buffer to help protect themselves. Now, the final part of this rule and equation is that you don't buy a home more than 3 times your income. So say you make $50K a year, then you wouldn't spend more than $150,000 on a home. If it's $100K a year, then you wouldn't spend more than $300,000. If it's $200K a year, then you wouldn't spend more than $600,000. So these guidelines can sometimes be really great in theory, but very hard in practice. But they're meant to be very conservative. Typically, people don't go broke being conservative. So it's a way to make sure that you don't end up house poor and end up in the trap of living paycheck to paycheck. And you might be sitting there saying to yourself, I live in California. There's no way that this is possible, and it might not be. But this is just meant to be a general set of guidelines and rules that you can follow, so that way you don't end up taking on too much before you can actually really afford it. Let's quickly touch on what exactly lenders look for in a potential buyer. It's going to be 2 things. One, it's how much money you make. So do you have 1 to 2 years of tax returns available? Do you have steady employment? And how much income do you actually generate? And then the second thing is how much debt do you have? Which is why I said earlier it's so important to have no debt, or at least try to mitigate it so that way you get favorable terms to borrow. They typically look at something called a debt to income ratio. So how much debt do you have relative to how much you make? So the general practice is a 45% ratio. So they'll consider all the debts that you have, so the consumer debt, so your credit card payments, and then your car payments, and then also your student loan payments, and subtract those by 45% of your income. And whatever number is left over is what's generally available for you to borrow. So the lower the debt, the more that they'll make available. So my final thoughts here is that this is going to be unique to your situation, right? So the person that makes $300,000 a year, this is going to be a much different conversation than if you make 50. That's because relative to how much you make, certain expenses are fixed. So say in that scenario you have 2 families with 2 kids, well, they're both going to be spending the same amount on groceries each week. So relative to the percentage portion of how much they make, the larger or smaller, there's a little bit more wiggle room, or you can get away a little bit more with the guidelines the more you make. I'm always going to recommend best practices and conservative strategies because I've seen so many people live well above their means and then struggle financially, and then those struggles lead to stresses, which lead to even larger issues. So that's all I've got for you in this video. Thanks for watching until the end. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out, and I'll see you guys again soon, so take care.